Thank you for joining the webinar, a conversation on climate diplomacy and energy transformation with Joel Jaeger from the World Resources Institute, organized by the Duke's Rethinking Diplomacy Program in collaboration with Duke University Nicolas Institute for Energy, Environment and Sustainability, the James E. Rogers Energy Access Project, and the Sanford School of Public Policy. This event is aligned with the goals of the Duke Climate Commitment, which unites the university's education, research, operations, and public service missions to address the climate crisis. The Rethinking Diplomacy Program is supported by a grant from the Trent Foundation. My colleague, Ambassador Pearson, Senior Fellow with the Rethinking Diplomacy Program, former US Ambassador to Turkey, former Director General of the Foreign Service, and a scholar with the Middle East Institute, will moderate the conversation with Joel and a group of distinguished Duke experts, including Jackson Ewing, Senior Fellow, Nicolas Institute for Energy, Environment and Sustainability, Adjunct Associate Professor at the Nicolas School of the Environment. Jibike Faborodi, Graduate Research Assistant at the James E. Rogers Energy Access Project. She's an engineer and graduating Masters in International Development Policy here at Duke, a Rotary Peace Fellow, and where she specializes in energy, environment-related policy advisory and innovation. Jonathan Phillips, Director of the James E. Rogers Energy Access Project at Duke. Thank you very much to all the panelists. Ambassador Pearson will introduce our guest speaker and moderate the event. We are going to have a first round of questions after initial remarks, and then audience members will have an opportunity to ask questions during throughout the event using the Q&A function. I'm Giovanni Zanarda, the Director of the Rethinking Diplomacy Program. Thank you very much, and Ambassador Pearson.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. I'm delighted to be here today, and I know this is going to be a very interesting conversation. So let me introduce Joel Jaeger first, please. He is a senior research associate at the World Resources Institute. His research focuses on the economics of climate change, green jobs, and non-linear systems change. He leads the assessment of global climate progress for the Systems Change Lab platform and the State of Climate Action Report series. He led WRI's global research on a green and inclusive recovery from COVID-19. He has co-led research projects on the economic opportunities of climate action in the United States and an assessment of the job opportunities and challenges of electric vehicles in Michigan. He previously worked in communications and research for WRI's new climate economy project, contributing to the 2016 and 2018 new climate economy reports. During his studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS, he supported climate negotiators in the U.S. Department of State in the Office of Global Change and did research on climate policy and electric vehicles for the Edison Electric Institute, which is the trade association of U.S. electric utilities. He has also worked as a journalist for the Interpress Service at the United Nations headquarters and interned at the Council on Foreign Relations. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Joel Jaeger. And Joel, I turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Pearson. It's a pleasure to be here today with all of you. Let me just share my screen here and pull my slides up. Let me know if you have any problems with seeing those. So today I'm excited to have a conversation with all of you, with my fellow panelists, and take all of your questions. But first, I'd like to start by doing a presentation just to make sure we're all on the same page here. Talking about climate change, climate diplomacy, and the energy transition. So first, I just want to start at a high level here in terms of what are we on track for in terms of global warming? How high will the global thermometer go? And so already the world has warmed by 1.2 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial levels. In 2015, nations around the world came together and agreed that they wanted to limit global warming to ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius. So are we on track to actually reach that? Looking at current policies and actions that governments have made, we're on track for around 2.7 degrees Celsius of warming. That's actually better than it was if you look 5 years, or if you look back at when the Paris Agreement was reached, or before that. We were on track for, some say as much as 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. So due to changing economics and due to government policies, there has been some progress that's made. But there are gaps in it here still, obviously. The first gap is the gaps between the current policies and what governments have said their targets are. Their targets for 2030, as well as their longer term pledges. Those are more in the range of getting the world to 2.4 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. So governments both have to increase their targets and pledges to get to that 1.5 degrees Celsius compatible world, as well as make sure their policies and actions are actually living up to those targets. So in terms of like, what do these numbers in terms of degrees of warming actually mean? There's been a lot of great new research coming up, synthesized by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which shows that really every fraction of a degree of warming is going to make a difference. Now, I said the goal is 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's what governments have agreed on. But even in that case, there is going to be a lot of consequences from climate change. I mean, we're already seeing them today, but in a 1.5 degree Celsius warming world, there's going to be biodiversity loss, there's going to be drought, there's going to be more days of extreme heat, there's going to be increased risk of flooding. And if you look at each fraction of a degree, each degree increase, those risks, if we're only able to reduce global warming to 2 degrees, it's going to be slightly more severe. If we don't really make much more progress beyond current policies and get into that 3 degree range, it's going to be even more severe. So I do sometimes hear people talking about like, okay, it's 1.5 degrees Celsius or bust. It's like either we win against global warming or we lose. And that's not the way I like to think about it, because like, if we could get below 1.5 C, that'd be great. But and if we don't hit it, it's not like we should just give up. We should instead be, every little bit that we do, every fraction of a degree that governments, are pushing for, is better. So it's sort of a sliding scale there. In terms of how we're going to tackle the greenhouse gases that are being emitted all around the world, the biggest sectors that we're going to have to deal with are energy, transport, industry, land use, and buildings. And the way that experts are kind of coming around and governments are coming around to how we're going to actually tackle this is kind of a multi-step process. The first is to decarbonize the energy system, and particularly the power system. So, by ramping down coal, which is the most polluting of all fossil fuels, and then especially, but also ramping down the others as well, and then ramping up renewable energy. So once the energy system is decarbonized, that means that we can electrify other parts of the economy and then power that with renewable energy. So in transport, shift to electric vehicles, and buildings shift to electric heat pumps. Industry, to electrify industrial processes where possible. Some you can do and some you can't do that. Those electrified technologies are more efficient in their own right, but then when you're powering them with decarbonized energy, that's how you get to a zero emissions world. And beyond that, there's a really important piece of this emissions pie, which is land use. The single most important thing to do is to reduce deforestation and then reforest and restore degraded lands, because forests are a really important carbon sink. They are preventing that they're basically storing this carbon, not letting it get out into the atmosphere. So at the World Resources Institute, one of the things that we do is we track the state of climate action in terms of like, what are the real changes, not in emissions, but in terms of like the actual economy, things that need to change. And so we track 40 or so different indicators. And unfortunately, right now, not a single one of those 40 is on track for those really ambitious 1.5 degree targets. But in some cases we're getting really close, and we're seeing progress that's getting us closer towards it. So here I just selected a few of them. I'm not going to go over all 40, but in terms of, we're seeing increases in renewable energy deployment, which is to some extent is energy demand is growing as well. So it's to some extent like the percentage of zero carbon sources is growing a little bit slower. We're seeing decreases in coal. We're seeing increases in the uptake of electric vehicles. So these all are going in the right direction, but need to accelerate in order to be on track. We're also going to need to see some behavior changes, ideally, and in terms of like modal shift, we call it, shifting from private passenger transit to walking and biking, or to public transit. In the industry sector, in some cases, the way to tackle this is by increasing energy efficiency and other in the carbon intensity of certain industrial processes like cement and steel and things like that. To some extent, that you actually, just by the nature of how these materials are created, you can't reduce those emissions. So in that case, you need to really pivot to completely different zero carbon technologies, whether that's zero carbon cement or green hydrogen, which is really low right now. And that's good, but it's more in that innovative stage, and with a bunch of announced projects that will have to turn into real projects. In terms of forests and land, as I discussed, deforestation, it's the most important thing to be watching. It's been going just up and down, really dependent. This one's almost entirely dependent on the government policy in terms of what governments are doing to prevent deforestation. And with Brazil's newly elected president, Lula, that's one of the ones to watch, where is like, will Brazil be able to successfully tamp down on deforestation? And in terms of food and agriculture, it's going to be important to reduce emissions from those impacts, to improve crop yields per acre, while also so you're also able to feed the growing population, which is expected to reach 10 billion over the course of this century. So the good news here is that the outlook and the economics have changed quite a bit in the last 10 years or so. And in large part, this is because of the falling prices of renewable energy. You can see here that solar PV and onshore wind in particular now have gotten to that point where they're not only cost competitive with fossil fuels, but they're actually cheaper than fossil fuels in the majority of countries around the world. And this is just a really exciting development here. It's now more economical to be building low carbon power. The question is just, are we going to be doing it fast enough? So a lot of my work is focused on the economics of climate change, and in the past it was really seen as like as more of a trade-off in terms of, oh, we need to be addressing climate change. How much is it going to cost the economy? And that lens has been shifting quite a bit, because there's an increasing body of evidence showing that that climate policy can in fact help the economy in certain ways. One of those ways is that when a government is doing green spending, and I was looking at this in the context of like green stimulus for that governments were putting in place for COVID-19. A lot of governments, when they were doing that, were investing in green solutions, and the economic multipliers for those investments, whether it's zero emissions power plant, whether it's ecosystem restoration, they can generate more more return than you're putting into it, and actually more return than when you're comparing that to fossil fuel expenditures or non-eco-friendly land use. In addition to into the economic activity as a whole, green investment specifically can be a better job creator. if you look at the number of jobs created per $1 million of investment, you're going to get more jobs from investing in building efficiency or in solar energy or in public transit than investing in fossil fuels such as coal or gas. One of the the interesting questions, happy to talk more about this at some point, is about the making sure that the quality of those green jobs that are being created is up to standard. And then finally, another part of this economic story is that the corporate commitments are really rising, and the private sector is getting much more involved in climate change. And in some cases, such as during the Trump administration, when the federal government wasn't really leading on climate in the United States, the private sector was actually stepping up even to a greater extent. So WRI, we are part of this initiative called the Science-Based Targets Initiative, where we help corporations put out commitments for emissions reductions that are in line with the latest climate science. And so as you can see in this graph here, the number of companies that are either committing to these targets or actually getting their targets approved by WRI and its partners as being in line with climate science has been increasing drastically. So I think this is a really promising sign in terms of the direction that the private sector is going. I also, though, would caution that public action really is needed. The private sector alone is moving in the right direction, but not moving nearly fast enough. So we do need public policies to make that happen. So I'll wrap up just kind of by looking ahead to the next conference of the parties of the UNFCCC Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is going to take place this fall in Dubai. So I think there's a few important things to watch, and I'd love to get more into these if you all have questions about them. But we've got coming up the global stocktake, which is a 2-year process which takes stock of what countries' commitments are, how they're doing, and hopefully helps those countries increase their ambition and implement those targets better. We've also got a really hot topic of loss and damage, which is looking at not how emissions can be reduced or how countries can adapt to climate changes, but actually what happens if there's irreparable damages from climate change, and there certainly will be. How do we address those, and how do we finance those? So that last year it was agreed that there'd be a financing mechanism for that, but all the details are to be worked out. And then I guess, yeah, I don't need to go into everything about COP. We can talk more about that later. But it will be a really interesting one to see because of who was selected as the host, Dubai, one of the biggest oil-producing nations in the world. So whether it'll still be able to be an ambitious COP is really an interesting question. Yeah, so I think I will wrap up there. I'm looking forward to the discussion and really excited to hear from all of you what you're interested in. It's such a broad topic, climate change and climate diplomacy, that there's a lot of avenues we could dive into. Thank you.
Joel, thank you very much for really a very, very interesting and very exciting lecture. I think from my own standpoint, more good news than I expected, even though I know that it's not all good news, but a kind of recognition that something has to be done and is being done. So what we're doing in our Rethinking Diplomacy program is focusing on how diplomacy can aid this process. So it appeared to me from what you said that while private industry is surging forward, it's not coming forward fast enough and needs to be drawn forward, if I can put it that way, by public policy and public subsidies or public funding. Is that an accurate appraisal? Or just to compare this, for example, with space. In space, private industry is racing far ahead government funding or government incentives. It's off on its own. In fact, if anything, it needs some form of control that doesn't exist now. But if you take the climate change environment, where is private industry here? Are they still looking for that government subsidy, or they are beginning to take off on their own momentum?
Yeah, well, I think that's something that really varies depending on what aspect of the energy transition or the climate transition that you're looking at, because some areas are much further developed than others. I think overall, yeah, that is an accurate assessment to say that we do need more of a government push to go faster. But that doesn't mean that private industry is just sitting around doing nothing. Like let's look at like thinking about electric vehicles for a minute. There's been just this huge movement of the world's biggest automakers towards electric vehicles in the last 5 years in terms of making those investments in electric vehicle in the design and in building up the supply chain. The announcements of EV battery investments, for example, in the United States, is been really exciting to watch. And automakers have said that they themselves are trying to get to 50%, have 50% of their sales be EVs by 2030. So that's quite a giant shift from where we are today. But then you also do have the government coming in to help make sure that doesn't hit any barriers, as well as to even accelerate it. The Biden administration has the EPA has just put out new emissions requirements for vehicles that will basically kind of make sure that automakers are actually following through on what they're saying, that it's not just it's not just a promise, that actually becomes that it's enacted and even goes higher than what it was than what was promised, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act from last year has new tax incentives for both EV consumers and producers to help accelerate this transition. So yeah, I think in that sense it's really both public and private moving kind of towards the same target there, but with help. In other sectors, like in the land use sector, it's going to, like I said before, it's going to have to be mostly public rather than private.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to pass the baton now to Jabike, and you will have the first question, and then I will go to Jackson Ewing and to Jonathan Phillips after that. Jabike, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. That was a really good sort of background to kick up the conversation. And something struck me when you were speaking about the power of the green growth agenda to really sort of multiply economic benefits, particularly in the area of jobs. And I wonder how this analysis sort of plays down for certain development contexts, like Africa, for example, where they have lower resource resilience when it comes to sort of resource generally, including sort of gas, which they're looking at as the sort of transition fuel, even though in your presentation, you did mention that, sort of fossil fuels do not multiply jobs fast enough as sort of on the scale of the green growth. And I just wonder what kind of implications this has for such countries that are already dealing with several other things that happen in parallel. Poverty is super high. Sort of mortality rates are also high. And how do you sort of achieve all of these things in parallel? Really implementing the transition agenda at the scale at which the green growth sort of requires, without having sort of adverse impacts on people who are already dealing with several strains, as well as several crises that are sort of affecting them. If that is clear enough.
Yes, that's a super important question. And I think it's at the heart of a lot of climate diplomacy going on right now, particularly questions around climate finance, because it is the richest countries, the highest income countries that are responsible for the most emissions historically, while it is the low emitting countries today who often happen to be located in those places that are most vulnerable to climate change, as well as don't have those resources to adapt as much as high income countries might. So I think that, first of all, there is a moral responsibility for high income countries to do something about that. And in some senses, there's been some promising developments on climate finance recently. For example, there was agreements between a group of countries, including the UK and South Africa, on a just energy transition partnership agreed at, I think that was COP26. And then just last year at COP27, there was a similar just energy transition partnership agreed between, I think it was like the US, Japan, some others, and Indonesia, where they agree to provide financing to those countries to help them transition away from fossil fuels. And like South Africa's 90% 90% coal actually in their energy sector. And so I think these are the sort of promising and bilateral diplomacy that is happening to support that. Now those two country examples are emerging economy type, like middle income type countries, where they actually already have the fossil fuel resources in place. They need to make that just transition. So it is also a slightly different one for low income countries that are building it from the ground up. And in those cases, I mean, there is this concept of leapfrogging where a country can, rather than going to fossil fuels and then transitioning to clean energy, jumping straight to clean energy. And it can be a better job creator in some cases, and like I said, and it might be the fastest way, for example, off-grid solar to get families that are off the grid to have access to electricity. But in those cases, it's a complicated thing there because, well, off-grid solar only has like a certain amount of electricity that you can get to. It's not going to be fully like, it's not going to be powering all the appliances of the like here in America. So in those cases too, getting the investment needed to build up grid-based renewable energy is a challenge because of, say, for example, the high levels of debt that many of these countries have. Again, I do think that is there's a certain amount that is just going to happen in terms of private investment, but there's going to have to be public investment, and there's going to have to be climate finance given by those high income countries. I probably talked about this enough, but yeah, it's a thorny question for sure, and a super important one when you're thinking about justice.
Thank you, Joel. Let me turn next to Jackson Ewing. Jackson, I know that you have done a lot of work comparing the American approach to climate change and the Chinese and the efforts in each country. And we all also know that China suspended climate change talks as a result of recent tensions between the US and China over Taiwan. I know that Secretary Kerry is trying to communicate to get the Chinese to restart those negotiations. I wonder if you could talk about the comparison between the two approaches of the countries, and if you want to, you can speculate about the chances that we might be able to get these two countries together again before too long to talk about these problems.
Sure, thanks, Ambassador, and thanks also, Joel, for the presentation. I'll try to respond to that briefly, then I want to ask Joel a question. I think that it's important to keep in mind on the front end how important the US-China relationship is to successfully reaching international climate accords. I would argue that the Paris Agreement would not have been negotiated in the way that it was, reached the outcomes that it did, or been ratified on the back end as quickly as it was, were it not for a series of bilateral agreements between China and the US between 2014 and 2016. During that period, we saw then President Obama and now still current President Xi in China see climate change as something of a confidence building measure amidst a wider relationship that was largely fraught with some of the same problems that we struggle with as nations here today. And as Obama's second term began to reach its conclusion, he and his administration used a series of executive orders to develop US climate policy and do so, to a certain extent, through quid pro quo agreements with China. I bring up this history because it still brings to the fore some important dynamics there. One is that there's been bipartisan agreement in the United States since the beginning of climate negotiations that moving aggressively on the issue, if large developing countries weren't called to make commitments of their own, is a political non-starter at home. It erodes our competitiveness in the international economic and trade landscapes without, in the words of people that are propagating this position, actually addressing climate change because of the current emissions and emissions potential of these large developing countries. And so what these agreements have done is create a structure whereby every country brings voluntary commitments that are then aggregated and ultimately, as Joel points out in his presentation, ideally putting us on a track closer and closer to our ultimate goal. Things have really been, as you mentioned, Ambassador, curtailed on the U.S.-China diplomatic front since those series of bilateral agreements. The Trump administration's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement provided China a platform to take its own version of climate leadership in the international stage. And since the Biden administration's move back into climate activity on the international stage from a public policy standpoint, we still have not seen that kind of re-engagement that would yield something like what we saw in the mid-2010s. There are some reasons for hope, and I'll end on this. One is that many of the same usual suspects are involved on both sides of the Pacific here. China has a special climate envoy named Xie Jinhua, who was instrumental in those bilateral agreements that I referred to earlier and has been kind of the father of Chinese international climate policy for decades. Similarly, Secretary Kerry in the United States was instrumental as Secretary of State during that period and is now in his own role as Special Climate Envoy. These people go back a long way. Many members of their staff, I should say, have also been working together for many years. I think there's a desire between these climate specialists in both countries to get the two largest emitters in the world back to the table together. But political spoilers abound. Top-down barriers are hard to overcome. So I know that's hedging a bit. We could be surprised by another agreement between China and the US in UAE later this year. If I were to make a prediction, I would say if that is to occur, it will be relatively tepid and may not occur at all. So Joel, my question is this, and it's very similar to Jabike's, but I do want to take it to a slightly different place. Jabike asked this in terms of developed and developing countries and the need for different investments in developing countries to manage the energy transition in a just way. I want to ask the same question, but rather than with countries with sectors. Even in wealthy countries, when we transition to new forms of economic activity and industrial production, and particularly energy production, we have groups of the population that are left behind. And I wonder if you have thoughts on how we can best transition to these new job opportunities that you map out in terms of green investment and show the promise of how investing green dollars yields better social and employment outcomes. in a way that also recognizes those whose jobs might become redundant, those who live in a particular geography within a country that might be left behind by these changes, and how we can ensure that we are using techniques in that transitional space that can be just, across a population, and really by extension be politically palatable and gain the support that it needs to ensure that these transitions happen quickly and happen fairly. Thanks.
Thanks, Jackson. And also, thanks for that overview of U.S.-China relations and climate change. I thought that was a really great overview. So in terms of thinking about a just transition within a country, I think all of the questions that you're raising are absolutely the right questions to be asking. My experience, I've mostly worked on the United States in this issue, just to clarify. WRI does have a Just Transition Center that you can look up online, and they've got examples of best practice for just transition around the world, that kind of each one hitting on a slightly different one of these topics, which I would highly recommend. But yeah, in terms of, it's true that while I said, that while green investments create more jobs, the effects are going to be uneven, and it's not like someone who is working, who's a coal miner can just magically become a renewable energy technician or work at an EV battery plant or something like that. So it's going to require support for those communities that are affected, because even if they could do that, maybe they don't want to leave where they're living, because those jobs are located in other places, as you mentioned, that geographical effect. It's going to require government investment and support for those communities that are affected. So it could be retraining, it could be to clean energy technologies, but it could also just be like general, it could be general, IT training, it could be healthcare training. There's really a wide variety. Just making sure that these communities that are entirely dependent on maybe a mine or on a particular factory don't lose that the people don't lose their living, and also that the community doesn't lose the tax base, because so much of the economy is based on that. So several states have put in place like just transition offices. Like Colorado has a new just transition office that's focusing on this, and in some cases there have been, like in Appalachia, the Power Initiative, it's called, in which congressional investments are supporting local retraining efforts for Appalachian communities that are affected. But I want to be honest that the history isn't so great on this so far. It's not so great on terms of like any sort of technology transition, like, the automation that has hit the US in various waves is kind of a similar example. And communities and people have been left behind in that case. So I do think that at this time around, it is important that we do it better. I've seen some analysis that really shows that it's, if you add up, like this actually is a cost, right? It's not like a win-win opportunity. There is a cost to supporting these people, but it's far, far smaller than people think it is, in terms of what it would take to just to provide some unemployment support, provide some retraining opportunities. And in cases of workers who are, in like say 55 and older, nearing retirement, a whole career change might be a little more difficult, that you could offer them early retirement packages if they want. So that is very important. The whole other half of this, though, is to also make sure that if folks are switching from a fossil fuel-based industry to a clean energy-based industry, that it's not a decline in job quality. With electric vehicles, for example, like right now, most electric vehicle battery plants are non-unionized. So someone switching, from working at an internal combustion engine vehicle plant to a battery plant, they often are going to be having lower wages, or just kind of in general, it's slightly lower. There's been some, there's a recent vote for one GM battery plant to be unionized. So there's some trends moving in that direction, but it's like the fossil fuel based industries, whether it's coal, whether it's internal combustion vehicles, whether it's natural gas or oil, have had decades and decades of collective bargaining, of efforts to make sure that those are quality jobs, whereas these clean energy industries are brand new and they're emerging in a atmosphere that's actually not nearly as conducive for worker leverage than it was decades ago. So that is why things like instituting prevailing wages as a part of federal investments in clean energy projects, where you say okay, there's a certain wage that any project that's getting support from a federal subsidy on clean energy, that they have to have wages at that level. I think that's why things like that are very important.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Joel, for the additional details on what is a question that everybody asks when they talk about the transition process. But let me turn now to Jonathan Phillips. And Jonathan, let us hear your comment and or your question.
Thanks, Ambassador. Good to see you. Thanks to Giovanni for hosting us here. Great comments, Joel. So I too am kind of focused on the international side. I run the Energy Access Project at Duke, and maybe I'll throw this at you in sort of your understanding of the U.S. market and trends and how it might benefit some emerging market situations. You showed that graphic about private sector investment really ramping up, and that's something that we're starting to see in the U.S. and certainly driven by the Inflation Reduction Act and policy and technology driven. But in thinking about how we drive that investment to the places that are actually in great need of it and where emissions are set to be rising over the coming decade, we're not there yet. And I hear you talking about, public investment is going to be needed. As part of that, we talked a little bit about just energy transition partnerships. I think that's a promising thing to follow. But there's also some other kind of developments that I'm curious if you're following, if you have thoughts on how optimistic you are. Things like growth of the voluntary carbon market. Carbon markets are things that developed markets have more experience with, not at the national level in the US, but regionally, and then in other developed markets. How does that transfer? Can that be a force for mobilizing private investment? Also, we have a new, there's a lot of thinking about how to use multilateral institutions better, more creatively, get them more focused on private sector mobilization. So we've got a new president coming into the World Bank, and I think there's a lot of momentum behind, getting multilaterals to do things a little bit differently. I'm curious if you have views on that. And then one sector in particular that is especially sticky, you had a chart on the agriculture sector and how we really need that to kind of ramp down. It's such a huge source of emissions. And it's been pretty flat, kind of incremental increases for a long time. But it's a sector that's especially relevant for the developing world if we're talking about not just solving for climate, but also solving for livelihoods and development. And really the language of climate in a lot of emerging markets is, around adaptation and livelihoods and green growth. So I guess it's a host of issues I'll throw at you. Agriculture, maybe are there lessons that we've learned in the US and other developed markets that might be transferable? And other things that you might be following on in terms of, multilaterals and other ways of mobilizing the private sector to emerging markets. Thanks.
All right, a whole host of thorny questions. Let's see, and none of them that I am a huge expert on. Just to be clear here, in terms of carbon taxes, I think 10 years ago or so, that really was carbon markets were a huge hot topic still among climate economists, and I think that has changed a fair amount, both because just of the failure of it to ramp up fast enough. The share of global emissions that are covered by carbon markets today is really small, and of that share, most of them, pretty much all of them, don't have high enough prices to make a huge difference in companies' activity. I mean, if we were able to implement all these things, carbon pricing could be a huge way to move things forward, but in tandem with other policies. But it's just I'm skeptical that enough will happen there in the next 15 years. That really crucial time period that things need to be moving. And then the other aspect is that we have found that other policies are doing a lot of the things that we had hoped that carbon markets would be able to do, in terms of subsidies, sometimes less economically efficient, but much more politically palatable, to be giving a subsidy rather than taking something away through a carbon tax. So maybe it costs a little bit more in the long run for the economy, but those are the things that have been able to stick politically, as well as something, rather than taking the approach of taxing gasoline, instead going more of the regulatory approach, just kind of forcing automakers or to have a certain amount of, the EU right now is planning on banning internal combustion engine vehicle sales by over the next decade or so. So I think I would love if there'd be more action on the carbon market, but I guess I'm not super optimistic on that front, and think that it's time to pivot to other avenues. In terms of how to use multilateral institutions better, I am also very looking forward to seeing what's happening at the World Bank with the new president, and having climate as more of an integral part of the World Bank's mission. WRI has been tracking the the investments of multilateral development banks for a while, and kind of showing that just how slow they are to change. So I guess I don't have a lot more to say than that, except it's going to require faster changes than those institutions have ever had in their past for them to effectively tackle this problem on the timescale that we have. Welcome to your thoughts on exactly how that might happen. In terms of agriculture, I want to be clear that we're not wanting to ramp down agriculture in lower and middle income countries. It's really the emissions that it's so important to be ramping down. We're actually going to have to often be ramping up the amount of food that we're actually producing. So doing that by increasing crop yields, and I think an important piece that is missing from a lot of the discussion is shifting diets away from meat towards plant-based proteins, and that's not something that's an easy sell in developed countries like the United States, but it's not like we need to 100% cut out meat, we need to all go vegetarian. It's another thing where every little bit of a change matters. Reducing in particular red meat consumption, not necessarily every bit of reduction of red meat consumption that we can have, the better. And in lower income countries, it's a lot of these countries actually do need more meat. Protein, need to actually have these protein options, but we need to make sure that we're kind of making these dietary changes in a way that is sustainable for the global agricultural sphere. In terms of lessons that we've learned, I think one of one of the important lessons that we can say from the US is like, don't waste good agricultural land on biofuels. That was something that was really something that people were looking forward, like we're thinking of as an important climate solution, but it turned out it hasn't worked as well as people thought it would in terms of reducing emissions. And so I think that they should be scaled down in the United States, as well as make sure that that's not spreading anywhere else. So I'm just touching on a few things. That's such a whole, agriculture is such an important sector that, and I don't have the expertise to give you too much more.
Okay, Joel, thank you very much for trying to cover the spectrum. Let me turn it back to Giovanni and for questions from the audience, and hope we have time to get some of those questions in. See, you're muted, Giovanni.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you to Joel and all the other speakers for their comments and questions. And now there are two questions from two students. I'm going to this one because it's connected to some of the issues that also Jonathan raised about multilateral diplomacy. I saw, this is from Luna Abadia. I saw COP28 President Dr. Sultan Al Jaber speak at the UN in New York last month. Knowing he's an ADNOC oil executive, I couldn't help but feel doubtful about several promises he made. Yet, diplomacy is all about working with different multilateral actors. Knowing past COPs have been influenced by their leadership and organization, how can negotiations work constructively with the context of the UAE this year? Thank you. I think this is a question in the mind of other students too.
Yeah, this is an important question, and I have not been to any COPs myself. I know some of my panelists, other folks on the panel have, so really curious to hear their thoughts. But from all of my colleagues who do go to these COPs and work on our international diplomacy team, they really do stress the importance of leadership at each of these COPs, as well as not just at the meeting itself, but in all of the preparatory meetings. You know, we're having one in Bonn next month, for example, to really set the tone. And with the Paris Agreement, the French presidency was extremely important in making that happen. Where so in this case, with an oil executive from Dubai being the head of COP, it's definitely a head scratcher in terms of, you know, in terms of this cognitive dissonance, in terms of Dubai, you know, being an integral part of OPEC and an important oil producer. But at the same time, the COP president, who's the head of the oil company, was also, you know, the one who founded the UAE's renewable energy state company. So and among the oil producing countries, Dubai has been one of the few to make some commitments and some, you know, a little bit more movement towards climate action. So it's not like we can ignore these countries who are so dependent on oil, because they're going to be part of the solution as well. I think that I think that in terms of how can negotiations work constructively within the context of the UAE, I think it's going to be it's going to come from accountability, you know, making like accountability in terms of civil society. I think has to play a role in terms of you know, activist organizations making sure that that Dubai is sort of walking the talk as well. And I think the influence of the negotiations from fossil fuel lobbyists will also be a really important thing. Yeah, do any of the other panelists want to talk to this question? Jackson?
Yeah, thanks, Joel, and thanks, Luna, for the question. I'll be brief. I agree with Joel's assessments here, and I just want to add a couple of quick things. One is, if we look at the history of the presidencies of the COPs, I think Joel is absolutely correct that it plays a very large role in the effectiveness of the process of the meetings and in the outcomes. And if we look at some former hosts with strong fossil fuel ties, Poland certainly comes to the fore, which has had COPs in Poznan and Katowice and Warsaw, all in fairly recent history. And one thing that we observe is that decarbonization solutions, and some would put solutions in air quotes there, that have some fossil fuel adjacency often get a bigger hearing in these sorts of contexts than they might if it was in a different setting. So in the case of Poland, we're looking at, for example, possibilities of cleaning up coal-fired power generation processes, because that was so essential and continues to be essential to the Polish economy. Shifted a bit in more recent years, but during those COP postings, that was something that got a strong airing. I think for looking ahead to the UAE, we should keep an open mind. The murmurings I'm hearing are more positive than I would have suspected in terms of the proactive approach that they're likely to take. But I don't mean that to suggest that that is a certainty. On the fossil fuel adjacent climate solutions that are likely to get a greater hearing because of this set of leadership, we would probably expect carbon capture and sequestration at the forefront there. And that is, just for all of our audience members, crudely put, when we try to, from the end pipe processes, capture the carbon content, and in some cases also particulate matter from power generation or industrial processes, and either sequester it underground or through pipelines, or utilize that carbon content to produce products. And it can be used in different products such as cement and different consumer and petrochemicals, things like that. So that is something that is more popular with countries and stakeholders that have a vested interest in the perpetuation of the fossil fuel industry, even in the context of some degree of decarbonization. Another place where that could come to the fore is the future of natural gas. In particular, the ability for natural gas replacing coal-fired power generation to yield some carbon reductions, even as the natural gas burning does continue to emit greenhouse gases. It's at a lower level than that which it is replacing. And also the future of potentially using natural gas in new innovative ways that are either more efficient or that intersect with the hydrogen economy, et cetera. Again, kind of a fossil fuel adjacent decarbonization strategy. So I'll stop there.
I saw Jabiki go off mute. Did you want to add something, Jabiki? I have one quick thought, but I defer to you.
Please go ahead.
I just want to say one quick thing on this. I've gone to the last couple of COPs and do not plan to go to the UAE, but look, I think the value, we need to recognize that the value of COP is increasingly on its coordination platform that it provides. It's not just a government to government diplomacy thing. We have the framework for international negotiations. The Paris Agreement established it. I see a growing value of COP as being this place where 50,000 people who care about climate get together and talk and plan and strategize. And it is, you know, we're going to replicate what we did at Sharm el-Sheikh last year, where this is the least sustainable conference that you can imagine, where all the power comes from fossil fuels, all the water comes from desalination produced by fossil fuels, 100% of the people have to fly to get there. I think the UNFCCC really needs to take this seriously as like the world sustainability conference. And that's my final bit. Over to you, Jabiki or Giovanni.
Yeah, I was just going to add to some of Jackson's points around sort of oil and gas adjacent decarbonization strategies, and just how I think it'll be useful to sort of prioritize some of those conversations as well for sort of African emerging markets, particularly those who are on the sort of oil producing side, because it's it's a bit of an hypocritical sort of agenda when you ask nations that have sort of contributed least to the emissions to sort of cut back or, you know, reduce or basically reduce investments in sort of new oil and gas type projects. And because all of these have like cascading effects on the economy, and even like the transition process doesn't just happen, you know, automatically. It takes a while, and it needs to sort of consider the different levels or different positions where like different nations currently are. For African nations or sort of other sort of low income or developing nations, these kind of conversations are quite critical. So in the case of decarbonization that, you know, really prioritizes the oil and gas sector, this US company recently delivered, I think it's called Occidental Petroleum, delivered like 2 million barrels of carbon neutral oil to India. And so bringing in some of these kind of use cases and seeing how lessons can be learned to adapt in sort of African markets will be really useful. And that whole process really used carbon offsets to ensure the carbon neutrality of the oil that was sort of that was transported to India. So I think beyond, yes, it's good to sort of try to amplify renewable energy, but on the scale of industrialization and economic diversification that be needed in some of these emerging markets, renewable energy would just, it would take a while for it to be able to meet that demand. And so how can we prioritize different strategies as we sort of talk about energy transition? I think that's my big takeaway from all of this. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you for all the comments. Just one last question, and it's something also connected to, since Joel, you are working on the new State of Climate Action 2023 issue. You might have the answer to this question. Did private sector commitments in regards to climate change increase in 2022?
I think I can safely say yes, but I don't have that data in front of me because it's also, in terms of the number of science-based targets, yes, it's been increasing each year. But there's so many different types of private sector commitments that there's no firm number that I'm going to be able to put on that. But I think in general, the amount of private sector commitments has increased each year, and like the COVID pandemic and associated economic downturn and response hasn't really changed that trajectory. And in some cases, like in Europe, it's actually increased that trajectory towards the movement towards clean energy and energy security.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you, Kansi, for the question. So since we are some minutes past the hour, I would like to say thank you all for the great conversation. Thank you, Joel, for taking the time to meet with us at Duke. And we are looking forward to the new issue, the State of Climate Action. I would like to say that the World Resources Institute publishes so many interesting reports, and the website, especially for the students who are not familiar with the website, is really a great place where to go for information related to climate change and all environmental issues we have been talking about and you are interested in, not only specific to COP28, but there are so many reports on different parts of the world, and I know that all the panelists here have been using one way or another some of these resources. And last, Ambassador Pearson, would you like to say a few closing words, please?
I just want to say that I think this is as comprehensive a discussion of climate change in 1 hour and a few minutes as I have heard in a long time, and a lot of different strands have been brought together. So I appreciate, Joel, your being here. I appreciate Jackson and Jabike and Jonathan being part of our conversation. And I think that it gives us as a Rethinking Diplomacy project momentum to look at other and related issues with climate change and bring those to public attention and discussion as well. So I thank you all for a great event, and look forward to the next one.
Thank you, and thank you all the attendees. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.